President Richard Nixon, who'd been elected in 1968, came to believe that it was time to loosen the American Cold War policies that had been in place since the 1940s. The U.S. entered a period of détente, a thawing in the Cold War. As part of this détente, Nixon made an unprecedented trip to Communist China in 1972, paving the way for eventual recognition of the mainland government, something the U.S. had refused to do since 1949. Only 3 months later, Nixon went to Moscow in a further move to ease Cold War tensions. There he concluded the first substantial arms control treaty with the Soviet Union called SALT I, for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It was the beginning of a series of arms control agreements between the two superpowers over the next 20 years. Elected in 1981, President Ronald Reagan revived the black and white rhetoric of the Cold War, often referring to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Reagan also applied his anti-communist beliefs toward Latin America. The United States had long considered South America to be part of its sphere of influence. Now, Reagan regarded any movement away from America's influence as communist. He strongly supported a military-backed regime in El Salvador by funneling billions of dollars in aid against a leftist reform movement. In Nicaragua, after a revolutionary group called the Sandinistas overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator in 1979, Reagan backed a conservative rebel group called the Contras with weapons and money. Congress opposed Reagan's policies and banned military aid to the Contras. Nevertheless, the Reagan administration continued the operation in secret, diverting money made from illegal arms sales to Iran to fund the Contras. The scandal became known as the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan also vowed to make America's military strong again, pledging, "We must find peace through strength." The cost of building up the military was tremendous. Over a 5-year period, the United States spent $1.5 trillion on defense and helped create a huge budget deficit. Reagan's stepped-up defense spending included funding for the partially space-based Strategic Defense Initiative known as Star Wars. To prevent the U.S. from gaining a military advantage, the Soviets tried to match U.S. defense spending. Already plagued with problems, however, the Soviet economy could not sustain the increased expenditures. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev knew that he could not repair the collapsing Soviet economy without cutting down on military funding, and in 1985, he began a series of summit meetings with President Reagan. In 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, or INF, an agreement to dismantle short and medium-range nuclear missiles. In 1987, President Reagan visited an economically vibrant West Berlin. He stood at the Berlin Wall and challenged Mikhail Gorbachev.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Gorbachev seemed to be moving the Soviet Union in a different direction than previous Soviet leaders. He instituted glasnost, a policy of political openness. Under glasnost, people could speak openly about problems in the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev instituted perestroika, a restructuring of the outdated and failing Soviet economy. Perestroika allowed for limited free enterprise in Russia. The spirit of glasnost and perestroika stirred the people of Eastern Europe to end communist regimes peacefully. thousands of East Germans went to Czechoslovakia, hoping to get visas to go to West Germany. Then East Germany, the most rigid and tightly controlled of all the Eastern European countries, began to stir. First, the East German leader was forced out of office, and then his successor ordered the opening of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. Days later, dismantling of one of the most infamous symbols of the Iron Curtain began. Within a year, Germany was reunited under a democratic government. President Gorbachev's efforts to keep the Soviet Union intact failed, and by the end of 1993, his successor, Boris Yeltsin, had overseen the dissolution of the Soviet Union into 15 separate nations. The Cold War was over. The rapid collapse of the Soviet Union and the sudden end of the Cold War left the U.S. and Western Europe scrambling to reshape a new world in which democracy and capitalism would flourish. But change did not reach everywhere. The liberalizing movement that had swept through Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was stopped cold in China. In 1989, student protesters staged a massive demonstration in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, demanding democracy. The government crushed the demonstration and killed many of the protesters.
The Chinese response was very much in line with the traditional response of the Chinese government to domestic political dissent. Don't tolerate it.
In Yugoslavia, the winds of change brought chaos. Under communism, Yugoslavia had been made up of separate republics, including Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Once centralized authority was gone, old rivalries flared up and a bloody and bitter civil war erupted. The war in Bosnia quickly degenerated into a brutal terrorist campaign called ethnic cleansing, in which Serbs forced thousands of Bosnian Muslims into detention camps and killed thousands more. In 1998, Serbs and Muslims negotiated a peace accord under the supervision of the United States, but fighting in the region had been so brutal that the UN established a war crimes tribunal to address atrocities committed during the war, including charges against former Yugoslavian President Slobodan Milosevic of murder, torture, and other crimes against humanity. What happened in the old Yugoslavia was just one example of how the Western powers struggled to find an effective way of dealing with international crises once the Cold War came to a sudden end. Even the United States, in effect the winner of the Cold War, found it difficult to adjust. The common enemy of Soviet communism, which had for so long provided the U.S. with a clear-cut objective in terms of foreign policy, was gone. The quick end to the Cold War left the United States as the world's one superpower. And as the 21st century dawned, America struggled to redefine itself in its dealings with the rest of the world.